December 1941 marked the moment when the world learned what happened when unstoppable force met immovable object, though nobody could have predicted which was which. On Christmas Day of that year, 1,175 Canadian soldiers surrendered at Hong Kong after 17 brutal days of fighting against a Japanese army that outnumbered them 5-1. The Winnipeg Grenadiers and Royal Rifles of Quebec had arrived in the British colony just 3 weeks earlier. Young men from Manitoba wheat fields and Quebec lumber towns who had never seen combat before. They carried Lee Enfield rifles that jammed in the tropical humidity and fought without air support, without naval backup, and without any real chance of victory. When British command finally raised the white flag, these Canadians became prisoners of war in an empire that viewed surrender as the ultimate shame, a dishonor worse than death itself. The Japanese military culture in 1941 operated on ancient Bushido principles that had governed samurai warriors for centuries. Every Japanese soldier learned from childhood that capture meant disgrace to family, emperor, and ancestors, stretching back generations. Their field manual, the Senjin-kun Military Code, stated clearly that soldiers must never suffer the shame of being taken alive. To the Imperial Japanese Army, a prisoner of war was already dead in spirit, a ghost walking among men, unworthy of the respect given to honorable warriors. This belief shaped everything about how Japan ran its prison camps. Guards received training that taught them prisoners had chosen humiliation over death, making them less than human. The Japanese high command expected these Western prisoners to grovel, to beg, to break within weeks of captivity. After all, how could soft men from comfortable democracies possibly endure what hardened Japanese soldiers would rather die than face? The first shock came at Sham Shui Po camp in Hong Kong, where Canadian prisoners spent their initial months before transfer to Japan. Japanese guards marched into the camp expecting to see defeated men with heads bowed in shame. Instead, they found Canadian officers still wearing their rank insignia, organizing their men into proper military formations, and demanding the Geneva Convention protections that Japan had never signed. Major John Crawford of the Royal Rifles refused to bow deeply enough to satisfy his captors, insisting that a crisp salute showed more military respect than groveling. Guards beat him with bamboo canes for this defiance, but the next morning Crawford stood at attention again, shoulders back, eyes forward. The beatings continued. Crawford kept standing. By spring of 1942, the Japanese began transferring Canadian prisoners to the home islands aboard hellships, rusting cargo vessels where men packed into holds designed for freight, not humans. The journey to Yokohama took 3 weeks, with prisoners receiving 1 cup of rice daily and a half cup of water in tropical heat that turned the ship's belly into an oven. 18 Canadians died during the voyage, their bodies thrown overboard without ceremony. The survivors arrived at Japanese ports weighing an average of 40 pounds less than when they surrendered. Guards watching these skeletal men stumble off the ships expected broken spirits to match broken bodies. Instead, the Canadians formed ranks on the dock, helped their weakest comrades to their feet, and marched in formation to their new prisons. The camps in Japan operated on starvation economics. Each prisoner received 600 calories per day, roughly what a moderately active person needs just sitting still, while working 12-hour shifts in shipyards, coal mines, and munitions factories. The rice contained more gravel than grain. The miso soup held mostly water with occasional seaweed floating like dark memories. Guards ate fish, pickled vegetables, and white rice while prisoners fought over spoiled cabbage. The Japanese military figured that prisoners would trade dignity for food, that hunger would accomplish what beatings could not. They built this assumption into every camp rule, every punishment, every humiliation designed to crush the human spirit. At Niigata Camp on Japan's west coast, 241 Canadian prisoners worked in a ball-bearing factory that supplied parts for Zero fighters. Guards expected sabotage, expected laziness, expected the passive resistance that prisoners throughout history had used against their captors. What they got instead confused every assumption in their training manuals. The Canadians worked harder than Japanese civilian workers, produced more bearings per shift, and maintained quality control that impressed even the factory managers. When guards questioned this bizarre behavior, Rifleman George MacDonald explained through an interpreter that Canadians took pride in any job worth doing, even jobs that helped their enemy. The guards could not process this logic. In their worldview, a captured man had no pride left to take in anything. Winter in northern Japan brought temperatures that dropped to 15 degrees below zero. The camps provided no heat. Prisoners slept on bare wooden platforms, wearing the same summer uniforms they had surrendered in, thin cotton that offered no protection against winds howling down from Siberia. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Tuberculosis spread through the barracks like wildfire, infecting 40% of prisoners by early 1943. Every morning, guards expected fewer men to answer roll call. Every morning, the Canadians appeared in formation, shivering but standing, supporting sick comrades who could barely walk. They shaved with broken glass to maintain military grooming standards. They fashioned makeshift razors from scrap metal and shared them around. Guards watched this ritual with growing unease, recognizing something they had seen only in their own elite units, a stubborn refusal to surrender dignity even when survival itself seemed impossible. The guards at Yokohama camp first noticed something strange during morning rice distribution in June 1942. Private Tanaka, a young guard from Osaka, watched as Rifleman James Houston received his daily portion, a cup of rice with 17 grains of barley mixed in that the guards had carefully counted to maintain exact rations. Houston took his cup, walked to where Corporal William Chen lay shivering with fever on his sleeping platform, and poured half his rice into Chen's bowl. Tanaka expected Chen to grab the food greedily, but instead Chen tried to refuse, pushing the rice back toward Houston. They argued in whispers for 2 minutes before Houston simply walked away, leaving his portion behind. Tanaka reported this to his sergeant, who dismissed it as a one-time incident, but the next morning Houston did it again, and the morning after that. By the end of the week, Tanaka counted 12 different Canadians splitting their rations with sick comrades, creating an informal sharing system that the guards had never seen in any prisoner population before. The evening sessions confused the guards even more. After 12 hours working in factories or unloading ships at the docks, prisoners returned to barracks so exhausted that some could barely climb onto their sleeping platforms. Japanese guards expected immediate collapse into sleep. Instead, starting in July 1942, clusters of Canadians began gathering in corners of the barracks for what they called study groups. Sergeant Lucien Dumais from Quebec taught French to English-speaking prisoners using charcoal on scraps of cardboard. Private Robert Manchester, a former schoolteacher from Winnipeg, ran mathematics lessons, scratching equations onto the wooden floor with nails. Guard Corporal Yamamoto watched these sessions for 3 nights before reporting to his commander that prisoners were wasting precious calories on education when they should be conserving energy for survival. The commander ordered the sessions stopped. The Canadians moved them to different corners, different times, quieter whispers. The guards gave up trying to stop something they could not understand. Christmas 1942 brought the moment when guards truly began to question everything their training had taught them. The Canadian prisoners at Niigata camp received the same 600-calorie ration as every other day, the same thin soup with the same absent fish that was supposed to be floating in it. No special meal, no acknowledgement of the holiday, nothing but another gray December day in a prison camp where celebrating enemy traditions would insult the emperor. But when guards made their evening rounds on Christmas Eve, they found the barracks transformed. Prisoners had fashioned a small Christmas tree from pine branches stolen from the factory yard, decorated with ornaments made from twisted ball-bearing wire they had smuggled out in their pockets. Someone had carved a nativity scene from scrap. Wood, the figures crude but recognizable. The Canadians stood in formation around this tiny tree singing Silent Night in French and English, their voices weak from malnutrition but steady with purpose. Guard Lieutenant Sayato stood in the doorway, listening to this song about peace and holy nights, watching men who had every reason to hate Christmas celebrate it anyway. He reported the scene to his commander and asked whether to punish this defiance. The commander said nothing for a long minute, then told Saito to leave them alone. The factory work details revealed contrasts that troubled guards more than any singing or studying. At the Kawasaki shipyard, where 120 Canadians worked alongside Japanese civilian workers, production supervisors kept detailed records that told a story nobody wanted to believe. The Canadian prisoners, working on starvation rations and weakened by disease, assembled more hull plates per shift than Japanese workers who went home to real meals every night. March 1943, the Canadians increased their output by 30% when the factory switched from building cargo ships to destroyers, work that required more precision and attention. The Japanese supervisors could not explain this. They called it a statistical anomaly, then called it impossible, then finally just stopped talking about it because the numbers kept proving the same impossible thing. Men who should have been too weak to stand were outworking healthy civilians, not through superhuman strength, but through systematic efficiency and attention to detail that Japanese industrial managers recognized from their own best workers. Guard Sergeant Nakamura began keeping a private diary in April 1943, entries he never showed to his superiors because they revealed thoughts that contradicted proper military thinking. He wrote about watching Canadian prisoners help each other through the factory gates after shifts, supporting men whose dysentery made walking alone impossible. He wrote about finding Canadians shaving at dawn using shards of broken glass, maintaining grooming standards that served no practical purpose in a prison camp. He wrote about the morning when Corporal James Reed stood at attention during roll call despite a fever of 104 degrees, refusing to report sick because his work detail was short-handed. Nakamura wrote that these behaviors reminded him of stories about samurai retainers who maintained honor codes even when their lords had fallen, who found dignity in duty itself, rather than in victory or defeat. But that comparison felt wrong because these were not samurai, just ordinary soldiers from a country Nakamura had been taught to view as weak and pleasure-seeking. The phrase started appearing in guard conversations by summer of 1943, whispered at first because it sounded disloyal to everything the Imperial Army represented. Guards began calling certain Canadian prisoners Yamato Damashi in Gaijin no Karada, the Japanese spirit in foreign bodies. It started as a joke, sarcastic commentary on prisoners who acted more Japanese than their captors thought possible. But the joke stopped being funny when guards realized they meant it seriously. Private Tanaka, who had watched Houston share his rice for over a year, told Sergeant Nakamura that he had learned more about Bushido from watching Canadian prisoners than from any lecture at military academy. Nakamura beat him for this statement, then wrote in his diary that night that Tanaka might be right. By late 1943, the cognitive dissonance had spread through the entire guard force at multiple camps. These were supposed to be broken men, defeated soldiers, prisoners who had chosen shame over death, but they maintained military discipline that many Japanese civilian workers lacked. They shared resources in ways that contradicted propaganda about Western selfishness. They found pride in circumstances designed to crush all pride. The guards had no framework for understanding this contradiction between what they saw and what they believed. Some guards became crueler, as if extra beatings might finally produce the broken prisoners they expected. Others became quieter, watching and wondering if perhaps their training had taught them the wrong lessons about strength and weakness, honor and shame. August 15th, 1945 arrived at Niigata camp like any other morning in 3.5 years of captivity. The sun rose over the Sea of Japan at exactly 5:47 a.m., casting long shadows across the barracks where 198 surviving Canadians slept on wooden platforms, worn smooth by thousands of nights of restless turning. 2 Canadians had died the week before from tuberculosis, bringing the camp's death toll to 43 men who would never see home again. The guards appeared for morning roll call, carrying the same bamboo clubs they had carried every morning since December 1941. Their faces showing the same mix of duty and contempt that Canadian prisoners had learned to read like a Familiar book. But something felt different in the air. A tension that had nothing to do with the usual prison rhythms of work details and rice rations and casual violence. At 7:15 a.m., Camp Commander Lieutenant Colonel Hiroshi Abe appeared at morning assembly for the first time in 6 months. Abe normally left daily operations to his sergeants while he handled paperwork in the administration building, a wood structure that leaked rain but kept him separate from the prisoners whose existence he preferred to ignore. His sudden presence made guards stand straighter, made prisoners exchange glances that asked silent questions nobody could answer. Abe stood before the formation of skeletal Canadians, men who averaged 112 pounds despite starting the war at healthy weights between 150 and 180. He held a single sheet of paper in hands that trembled slightly, and when he spoke through the camp interpreter, his voice carried none of the harsh authority that usually marked official announcements. The Emperor had spoken on the radio that morning, Abe said. Japan had accepted terms of surrender. The war was over. Prisoners would be released to Allied authorities in the coming weeks. Abe folded the paper carefully, bowed stiffly to the assembled Canadians, and walked back to his office without another word. The guard stood frozen, not knowing what to do in a world where the Emperor himself had admitted defeat, where everything they believed about Japanese invincibility had proven false. They expected the prisoners to cheer, to celebrate, to break formation and dance and shout with joy at their liberation. They expected chaos, the release of 3.5 years of suppressed rage and suffering. The Canadians did not move. Major John Crawford, who had been beaten 127 times by guard count for various infractions of camp rules, called his men to attention. They snapped to position as one body, back straight, despite spines curved by malnutrition, eyes forward, despite vision blurred by vitamin deficiencies. Crawford ordered a right face. The formation turned in perfect unison. He marched them back to the barracks in step, their footfalls synchronized despite feet wrapped in rags because their boots had worn out 2 years earlier. The guards watched this impossible discipline and felt something crack in their understanding of the world. 3 days later, Lieutenant Colonel Abe requested a formal meeting with Major Crawford in the camp administration building. The interpreter, a Japanese civilian named Takeshi who had worked at the camp since 1942, later wrote about this meeting in letters he sent to Canada in 1967. Abe sat across a wooden table from Crawford, tea prepared for both men, the first time in the war that a Japanese officer had offered a Canadian prisoner anything resembling hospitality. Abe spoke for 20 minutes while Takeshi translated, his words coming slowly as if each one cost him something valuable. "Your men possess warrior spirit we thought only Japanese could have," Abe said. His hands gripped the teacup hard enough to turn knuckles white. "For 3 years I believed you were weak because you surrendered, that Western men lacked the discipline and honor of our samurai tradition. But I watched your soldiers share food when they were starving, maintain military order when chaos would have been easier, work with pride even in defeat. My guards have beaten you, humiliated you, worked you beyond endurance. Yet every morning you stood at attention with dignity that shamed us. You taught me that I understood nothing about strength." Crawford sat silent for a long moment, looking at this man who had presided over 43 deaths, countless beatings, systematic starvation, and years of calculated cruelty. Takeshi the interpreter held his breath, wondering if Crawford would spit in Abe's face or accept this inadequate apology. Crawford finally spoke in a voice roughened by years of shouting orders over factory noise. "We did what soldiers do," he said. "We survived with honor. That is all." The following days brought a transformation that guards found more disturbing than any battlefield defeat. Sergeant Nakamura, who had beaten Canadian prisoners at least twice weekly for 3 years, approached Rifleman George MacDonald during morning rice distribution on August 20th. Nakamura bowed deeply, a gesture of respect given to social superiors, and spoke in broken English he had learned from listening to prisoners talk. "I am sorry," he said. "You teach me what strong means." MacDonald later wrote in his diary that he accepted the apology but could not forgive what it could never erase. The friends who died from beatings, the permanent damage to lungs and hearts and spirits that no apology could repair. More guards came forward with similar statements over the next 2 weeks. Private Tanaka told James Houston that watching him share rice for 3 years had taught Tanaka more about honor than military academy. Guard Corporal Yamamoto approached the Canadian study groups he had tried to shut down and asked if they would teach him English, saying he wanted to understand the culture that produced such stubborn dignity. Some Canadians accepted these overtures with cautious civility. Others turned away, unable to reconcile years of abuse with sudden claims of respect. The guards seemed to expect forgiveness as automatically given as their earlier cruelty had been automatically administered, not understanding that respect earned through suffering feels different than respect freely offered. The ideological collapse rippled through the entire guard force as they grappled with contradictions their training had never prepared them to face. They had been taught that Western democracies produced soft men, that individualism meant selfishness, that cultures without samurai's tradition lacked true discipline. But the evidence before their eyes told opposite stories. The Canadians had maintained collective unity stronger than many Japanese military units. They had found honor in circumstances designed to strip all honor away. They had proven tougher than guards who had every material advantage over them. Some guards responded by doubling down on their old beliefs, insisting that Canadian behavior was an anomaly that proved nothing about Western weakness. Others fell into confused silence, unable to articulate what they now believed instead. Rifleman George MacDonald wrote in his diary on August 27, 1945, a passage that captured what many Canadians felt, watching their former tormentors struggle with newfound respect. They finally understood we were not weak for surrendering, MacDonald wrote. We were strong for surviving. They thought breaking our bodies would break our spirits, but they never understood that Canadians do not quit just because circumstances turn hard. We held on to dignity when they tried to take it because that was the only thing they could never steal unless we gave it away. Now they call us samurai and talk about warrior spirits, but they miss the point entirely. We were not trying to be Japanese. We were just trying to stay Canadian, to remain who we were before they captured us. That turned out to be harder and more important than anything their Bushido code ever demanded. September 1945 brought the surviving Canadians home on hospital ships that took 3 weeks to cross the Pacific, the same ocean they had crossed as prisoners aboard hell ships 3 years earlier. This time they traveled in real beds with clean sheets, ate 3 meals daily from trays delivered by Navy medical staff, and gained an average of 12 pounds during the voyage, despite doctors warning them to eat slowly because their shrunken stomachs could not handle normal portions. Of the 1,075 Canadians who surrendered at Hong Kong in December 1941, only 1,018 stood on deck watching the Vancouver coastline appear through morning fog on September 27. The other 557 lay in unmarked graves across Japan and Hong Kong, a death rate of 28% that made the Canadian-Hong Kong experience one of the deadliest POW situations for any Allied force during the entire war. The ships docked at Vancouver Harbor at 11:30 a.m. on a Thursday morning with rain falling in sheets that soaked the waiting crowds of families who had gathered despite the weather. Rifleman James Houston stepped onto Canadian soil weighing 103 pounds, exactly 72 pounds less than when he had shipped out to Hong Kong 4 years earlier. His mother did not recognize him at first, walking past this skeletal stranger until Houston called her name in a voice she barely knew. Similar scenes repeated themselves hundreds of times along the dock as families tried to match the broken men before them with memories of sons and husbands who had left home young and strong and confident. Some returning prisoners carried nothing but the clothes on their backs, thin cotton, uniforms issued by American forces in Japan because their original uniforms had rotted away years ago. Others clutched small bundles containing items too precious to leave behind, a diary written on stolen paper, a handmade chess set carved from factory scrap wood, photographs of fellow prisoners who had not survived. The contrast hit them in waves that first week home. Grocery stores overwhelmed them with choices. entire aisles dedicated to breakfast cereals in a country where rationing had ended and abundance flowed like water. Major John Crawford stood frozen in a Vancouver Safeway for 15 minutes, staring at shelves stocked with 30 different types of bread. Unable to process this impossible variety after years of measuring rice grain by grain. His wife found him there, tears running down his face, and led him outside where the choices felt less crushing. Others struggled with electric lights that worked with a simple switch, hot water that flowed from taps without needing, to be boiled first, beds with mattresses instead of bare wooden platforms. Rifleman George MacDonald ate his first restaurant meal at a diner near Halifax and could not finish a hamburger that weighed 8 ounces, more meat than he had eaten in any single week during his final year of captivity. The families wanted to hear stories, wanted to understand what their fathers and sons and husbands had endured, but most returning prisoners found themselves unable to speak about it. The experiences lived in a place beyond normal language, in memories of watching friends die slowly from diseases that should have been treatable, of beatings for infractions as small as failing to bow deep enough, of hunger so constant it became a permanent condition rather than a temporary discomfort. How could they explain to people eating Sunday dinner what 600 calories felt like stretched across a 12-hour work shift? How could they describe the pride of maintaining military discipline to families who had never faced a choice between dignity and survival? Most chose silence instead, pushing memories down into locked chambers of their minds and refusing to open those doors even for people who loved them. Corporal William Chen returned to his family's restaurant in Vancouver's Chinatown and went back to work washing dishes, the same job he had left to enlist in 1939. His younger brother asked him once about Japan and the camps, and Chen said only that he had survived and wanted to focus on the future rather than the past. He never spoke of it again. Not to his brother, not to his wife when he married in 1947, not to his children when they asked years later why their father sometimes woke screaming from nightmares he refused to explain. This pattern repeated itself across Canada as returning Hong Kong veterans tried to reintegrate into a society that could not understand what they had experienced and did not know how to ask. The decades passed in silence, broken only by occasional reunions where veterans could talk to the only people who truly understood. They built careers, raised families, contributed to post-war Canadian prosperity, and carried their memories like invisible scars that never fully healed. Rifleman George MacDonald became a school teacher in Winnipeg, teaching history to students who learned about World War II from textbooks that mentioned Hong Kong in a single paragraph. He never told his students he had been there, never shared his diary entries about watching guards learn respect through 3 years of failed cruelty. The silence became its own burden, heavy with things that needed saying but could find no adequate words. Then in the late 1960s and early 1970s, letters began arriving at Canadian addresses from Japan. Former Guard Sergeant Nakamura wrote to James Houston in 1967, a letter that took 3 months to compose with help from an English-speaking friend. Nakamura wrote that he had spent 20 years thinking about the Canadian prisoners at Niigata camp, that watching them maintain dignity under impossible conditions had changed his entire understanding of strength and honor. He asked forgiveness for specific beatings he remembered administering, listing dates and reasons that showed he had carried his own burden of memory across the decades. Houston showed the letter to his wife, the first time he had ever discussed his captivity with her, and wrote back a careful response that accepted the apology while making clear that forgiveness did not erase what could never be undone. More letters followed from other guards, each attempting to articulate lessons learned from watching prisoners who refused to break. Private Tanaka wrote that he had left military service after the war and become a teacher, that he tried to instill in his students the same dedication to principle he had witnessed in Canadian prisoners sharing rice while starving. Guard Corporal Yamamoto sent photographs of himself visiting graves of Canadian prisoners who died at his camp, flowers placed on markers he helped maintain at his own expense for 25 years. These letters revealed men who had spent decades grappling with the same memories that haunted their former prisoners, trying to reconcile the casual cruelty of their youth with the unexpected respect they had learned from victims of that cruelty. The Canadian veterans who received these letters faced difficult choices about how to respond. Some wrote back with varying degrees of forgiveness, acknowledging that young guards had been trapped in an ideology they did not create. Others burned the letters unread, unable to accept apologies from men whose actions had killed their friends and damaged their bodies permanently. There were no correct answers, no proper way to process this strange peace offering that arrived decades too late to change anything that mattered. Major John Crawford, who outlived most of his fellow Hong Kong veterans and died in 1994 at age 78, gave an interview to a Canadian journalist in 1989 that captured what many veterans felt about their experience. The journalist asked what Crawford had learned from 3.5 years in Japanese prison camps, expecting stories of hatred or bitterness or trauma. Crawford thought for a long minute before answering in words the journalist later said she would never forget. "I learned that true resilience is not about breaking your enemy," Crawford said. "It is about refusing to let your enemy break you. The Japanese tried everything to crush our spirits, but they could not take what we would not give them. In the end, they respected us for the same stubborn dignity they tried so hard to destroy. That taught me something important about human nature. We are strongest not when we are comfortable, but when we choose who we will be in circumstances designed to strip away that choice. My guards learned about strength from watching their prisoners survive. I learned about my own strength from refusing to become what they expected me to be."